I wish I could change that voice. You know how like on your phone, your GPS, you could switch it to like a British or Australian voice or something like that. Yeah, that recording in progress. I'm not a fan of it. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining us here today with Devon Gray of EPIC, Ending Poverty in California. And as Devon and I were discussing right before everyone came on, I'm really horrible at introductions. So Devon, I'm going to let you take care of that and look forward to hearing the presentation. Then we'll have time for Q&A with everyone.
Fantastic. Really appreciate it, David. Good to meet everyone. So yeah, Devon Gray, I lead an organization called End Poverty in California. We'll dive into a little bit of the background of the organization, but my personal background is I'm from the Anaheim area, so Orange County. Grew up, in a place much like other parts of California with tremendous amounts of income inequality, and I think seeing how that shaped people's trajectories of the folks that I grew up with really is foundational in my worldview towards poverty being a central challenge that Californians experiencing, and all of us who care about the future of the state can't really ignore. So I went to law school, thankfully never practiced law because I think I saw the light early enough, but worked in politics for a long time. Worked for Beto O'Rourke in Texas for a while, doing gun safety plans for him. Worked for Governor Newsom for a year during 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. Worked at a consulting firm for a bit, and then Mayor Michael Tubbs of Stockton, who founded our organization, was a client of mine, and then sort of stole me over to run this organization. So I've been with him for the last couple of years now. But excited to talk to you about our organization and what we've been doing since 2022 and the amount of work that we've been and time we've been spending on the road in California, learning from people in communities affected by poverty and those sort of proximate to poverty as well about the nature of the challenges, the story that we tell about poverty, and the ideas that people have for how we can ultimately end it in California. So Christina is my colleague. She's been really instrumental in making the listening tour of the state happen. So really excited to talk about that. Couldn't have done without her, especially over the last 6 months or so. And I know she has some slides that I have that we can tee up to, that way you don't have to like stare at me the entire time that I'm talking. We can actually give you some visuals to chew on a little bit. So like I was saying, I can go to the second slide. We're an organization that was founded by the former mayor of Stockton, Michael Tubbs. And you might be familiar with him and his story, in addition to being the youngest ever mayor of a large city in the United States. He was 26 when he was elected mayor. He's perhaps best known for being a champion of a policy called guaranteed income, which is essentially an anti-poverty measure of, rather than having people jump through hoops and sign up for programs and fill out applications, you just give people money, no strings attached, as a method of giving them an economic foothold. And he was perhaps most famous for leading the first guaranteed income pilot led by a mayor in American history, where about 150 low-income families in Stockton were given $500 a month for 18 to 24 months. And the results of that were uniformly successful. People spent the money on groceries and utilities and school supplies, and people had improved health outcomes, improved income outcomes, obviously, as well, and a host of long-term effects. And it's been catalytic for several dozen, if not getting to close to 100 similar pilots around the country as well. So guaranteed income is sort of at the heart of the work that we do as a method of poverty alleviation, particularly because it instills trust in people. It sort of tries to push back against the harmful narratives around trustworthiness and deservedness that shape so much of economic policy discourse in this country and frankly, around the world. We can go to the next slide. We are principally a policy advocacy organization that tries to advance bills in the state legislature and in the governor's office around things like making the safety net more robust in terms of the amounts of money that people get, but also the accessibility and stability of the safety net programs themselves. We also focus a lot on labor protections and worker empowerment, in addition to high wages to make sure that people who have a job and are working 40 hours a week have enough money to be able to support a family. Housing as a human right with a focus on tenant protections to keep people housed in the short term, but also the streamlining of affordable housing to, in the long term, drive down costs to make home ownership more accessible for folks and keep rents lower for people at all income levels. Wealth creation, whether it be through policies like baby bonds or through making home ownership more accessible, and then shared safety and second chances, really trying to make our criminal legal system less punitive and more constructive and more focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment, and also trying to eliminate the criminalization of poverty that we see manifest in so many different ways. We can go to the next slide. The reason why we started this organization, though, I think is frankly because of the urgency that so many of us see on a day-to-day basis. We think we can all recognize that at the heart of the California experience is a real contradiction. We do so much right, and then we get so much wrong all at the same time. California has so much going for it. Of course, we have the fourth or fifth largest economy in the entire world. We have more billionaires in California alone than any country in the world aside from the rest of the US and China. We're third on that, so we have an incredible concentration of wealth here. But we also have great resources like a diverse economy, a booming tech industry, the best public universities in the entire world. And we have tremendous political capital here for folks who care about economic mobility. Supermajorities of Democrats in the state legislature, every constitutional officer, most big city mayors, all at least on paper, saying that they're committed to economic mobility and reducing, if not outright eliminating poverty. And yet, California on average has the highest rate of poverty of any state in the entire country when you take into account cost of living. We have nearly 5 million Californians living in poverty. A third of our households struggle to make ends meet. We have 1 in 8 children in our state going hungry at any given time. So there's a clear disconnect between the resources that we have in California and our ability to lift people out of poverty and allow them to have real economic mobility. And our diagnosis for why this is not because we need to elect a different cohort of politicians or that we need to grow the economy more. Our economy is doing really well for the people who are doing really well. Our diagnosis of why we haven't been able to solve these problems is really the story that we tell about poverty, about why it exists for certain people and not others, and ultimately what the remedies are, regardless of what the research might suggest. You can go to the next slide. When we talk about the stories, what we're really getting at is the popular narratives around poverty. And when I talk about what a narrative is, really in any context, a narrative is the story that we tell or that we've been told, that we internalize, that explains why things are the way they are. And very often, narratives are very good at justifying the status quo. I think sort of as humans, it's our nature to explain things to be why they are the way they are, right? And when it comes to poverty, the narratives are ones that we're all going to be familiar with. But at their core, even though they manifest in different ways, at the core of them is that poverty is at its, principally an individual failing. So when we hear things like the bootstraps myth that, if anyone can just pick themselves up by their bootstraps and work hard, they can find economic success in the United States, or that poverty is a choice that people make, or that people are poor because they're lazy, or because they can't be trusted with money, or because they're addicted to drugs, or any number of things, that really gets back to the central idea that people believe that poverty is fundamentally the fault of the people experiencing it. And we think that all of us who have either lived in poverty or approximate to poverty recognize that that isn't just an incomplete story, it's a really pernicious one too. So what we're trying to do as an organization is tell a more authentic story that centers the voices of people experiencing it and really tries to drive home what we believe to be a fact, that poverty is much more likely a consequence of structures and systems and policy choices that make poverty an inevitability for a large chunk of our population. One other thing that I think is worth mentioning too is, it's not just that the harmful narratives around poverty are false or offensive or like damaging to our self-consumption, though they are. I think the reason why we focus on it so much is because they have very real, tangible policy consequences. The ways in which we make decisions in a given budget, the policies that we advance, the policies that we don't advance, who's afforded power and who isn't, is ultimately a consequence of the story that we believe about poverty. And I think there's been a really salient one that maybe some of you are familiar with, but I think it's worth sharing to sort of orient you as to why we're doing all the work that we're doing. Back in 2021, in the first few months of the Biden administration, congressional Democrats and the president advanced a very large bill called the American Rescue Plan that was designed to lift the economy out of sort of the slump that we were experiencing at the height of the COVID pandemic. And the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, was a multi-trillion-dollar omnibus bill that included many things, but the think the signature policy of it was the expansion of something called the child tax credit, which essentially is, the government is giving people who qualify for this tax credit free money, more or less. So because of this expansion of this program, every family in the United States making below $150,000 a year, if you had a kid under 18, you got $3,000 in your bank account per kid each year. And if you had a kid under 6, you got $3,600 a year. This was a big expansion of this program, and predictably, the results were really strong for families all over the country. We saw in the following year, the US achieved its lowest ever poverty rate, and child poverty in particular was more or less cut in half overnight as a result of this policy. A remarkable achievement that the Biden administration is certainly running on in the next election. And you would think that that would just be the end of the story. We did a good policy, we had really good outcomes, it was a good investment in people, and people used the money in ways that we would deem like responsible, right? They spent it on groceries and utilities and everything else. But unfortunately, when the program was up for renewal the following year, Senate Republicans and Joe Manchin, so it was a bipartisan effort technically, killed the program because, and Joe Manchin was quoted as saying this, they believed that families were going to spend the money from the government on alcohol and drugs. And it didn't matter that all the research showed that this wasn't the case. It didn't matter that that folks who actually receive money, cash aid from the state or from the government, federal government, actually are more likely to be gainfully employed, which makes sense because if you have money for childcare and transportation, it's easier to hang on to a job. None of that mattered, but they killed the policy because the narrative was so powerful, right? And as a result of that, we had some disastrous consequences. We saw the single largest one-year increase in poverty in American history. And we saw 3 million kids thrust back into poverty who wouldn't have otherwise been. So it's important to recognize that the narratives and the stories about poverty aren't, like I said, just offensive. They lead to very tangible policy outcomes, and there's plenty of other examples of that as well. So to sort of take a step back into EPIC's evolution, because we're sort of coming into our being around the same time that this debate is happening around the child tax credit. And we recognize that we're a small organization in a state with a huge ecosystem of anti-poverty advocates who tackle the issue through different lenses. But we really needed to, as we're getting off the ground, operate with a little bit of humility and try to really understand the challenges that we're trying to take on. If we claim to be in service of people experiencing poverty in California, we need to have enough humility to recognize that we can't be the ones on high talking about what needs to be done. The solutions have to come from the communities who are experiencing the challenges that we're trying to take on. And to that end, it made sense for us to hold community listening sessions to learn directly from people that were impacted by poverty. And again, people have been doing this work for a long time, so we had a lot to learn from other folks. So what we started doing even prior to our launch, which happened in February 2022, so in the months preceding this, we started holding events in partnership with some local organizations throughout the state where we would convene 20 to 30 folks who were living in poverty currently, get them into a room and ask some pretty open-ended questions so that we could learn. Questions like, what does government get wrong about poverty? How does poverty manifest in your community? What are your ideas for ending poverty? And we learned a ton from that. And this process didn't, it wasn't with a tour of the entire state in mind. We were really just trying to orient ourselves so that way we could hit the ground running. We started with a tour stop in Fresno. We went to South Los Angeles. We went to Compton College. We realized very quickly that we were learning more than we expected that we would learn, and that it would be silly for us to not continue this learning process, this listening tour, and ultimately start documenting our learnings. And then when we were more public facing as an organization, we were doing more things in the media, we decided that it made sense for us to bring a film crew with us and start a tour of the entire state because we felt that we could do a better job sharing the stories of Californians, both for ourselves and our own edification and advocacy, but also to try to shift the narrative more publicly, and that we could do that more effectively through video work rather than just through written work alone. So the picture you see here is from our tour stop in the city of Antioch, which is in the East Bay. It's in Contra Costa County. You can see some of the tour stops that we did in the map there. We've now been, over the last 2 years, to 20 of California's 58 counties. We aim to get to all 58 within the next handful of years. But Antioch was a particularly interesting listening session for us. I think we went in August of 2022. It turns out to be the eviction capital of the entire Bay Area. So it's at the epicenter of the state's housing crisis. Antioch actually had, at least at the time, an eviction rate that was 22 times higher in the city of Oakland, which is a place that is not immune, certainly, to issues with the housing crisis. So we have a video in the next slide just to sort of give you a picture of what a listening session looks like. So it was moderated by Mayor Tubbs. They weren't all moderated by him, but some of the ones that we filmed were. And it kind of gives you a picture into what these events look like. We can give that a play.
We are in Antioch, California for a listening session on the Epic Listening Tour. This time focused on housing and homelessness and tenants' rights. I was a young kid in Southside Stockton with a mom who made about $25,000 a year with a dad who's still incarcerated and who lived in hotels, lived in homeless shelters until we finally got housing. And we all like California, given that we live here. But we also know that the Golden State's not really golden for everyone, particularly with how expensive it is. So we decided to come to Antioch because we found out that Antioch is literally one of the eviction capitals of the state.
Yeah, yesterday I was in an apartment complex. Just in those apartment complexes, there was 18 evictions happening.
So it's like the leasing office is like, hey, you need to pay this, and they're giving like 3-day notice.
Wow.
On that bill that is due, like you need to pay this in 3 days or move on top of the rent that's coming up. Yeah, and that's what's happening to me.
There are 800 evictions in the pipeline in East County alone.
A lot of people have been talking about maybe like something called right to counsel or legal aid, and that if that was like a policy or a law, that if you were evicted, you were given like legal help or a lawyer, that would be helpful. Does that resonate as something that would be helpful or no?
What Contra Costa did at the Board of Supervisors meeting yesterday was they allocated $70,000 for legal services in East Contra Costa.
I never understood when they say like the low income apartments and things like that. How low is low for your, what is low?
You have to be in like the minority that's making a certain amount or under amount to get it.
Es por eso que la mayoría de las familias no acuden a programas, ¿verdad? Porque son temerosas en el momento que le dicen, tienes residencia, tienes esto, o no calificas porque tú eres ilegal. Es un programa para todo el mundo, puesto que residimos aquí.
I just flag where we are. And it seems like there's a bunch of state stuff that should happen, but there's also a bunch of local stuff that has to happen as well. Like I know government budgets, and to budget $70,000 for legal aid is disrespectful.
And there's a problem with housing. There's a lot of students that don't have housing just last school year, and it's a struggle. For this next school year, I'm gonna be in an apartment with 5 other people, and it's gonna be over $4,000.
It's a big issue with the new families. Unfortunately, like in my case, my kids say, sorry mommy, no grandkids. No grandkids because we can't even afford ourselves. Where are we gonna end it?
No matter where we are in the state, we could be talking about community college students, and the issue comes back to housing. So the fact that it's not like a special issue, it's not like a fringe issue, it's a mainstream, widespread, normalized issue. I think housing, like food, is just a necessity, and the solutions are gonna take time to implement, but if we don't start, it'll never happen.
All right, so we can go to the next slide. So just to do a quick overview of some of the things that we learned, we can dive into it into the Q&A as well. In the first year, went to half a dozen counties across the state, and there were some real recurring themes. Access to the safety net was certainly something that we heard everywhere that we went, both in the fact that, applying for CalFresh or CalWorks or any of our programs takes just too long to fill out forms for different programs. We need to have some sort of streamlining to be able to make it easier for folks. It takes less time. Housing supports both for rent protections, tenants' rights, but also the ability to buy a home, the income floor that we need to establish through guaranteed income and other forms of tax credits, and then worker supports, both through the labor movement, but also through entrepreneurial supports as well. Some other ones from the more specific places that we went, but we can go to the next slide too. And then In the second year, what we really tried to do was, as we continue to recognize that the stories that we heard, we went to places like LA, the Bay, Fresno, some of the larger population centers. The stories that we heard, weren't super surprising for those of us that have been paying attention to this stuff. We always learned something really useful. I think where to prioritize resources was always a good learning. But in a state with 40 million people and 40 million stories, recognize that there are certainly parts of the state that are excluded from the California narrative. So we wanted to spend some time going to places that aren't so often visited by organizations like ours. So we spent an entire week in the rural north of California, places like Eureka and Redding, all the way up to the Oregon border, learned a lot about the ways that rural poverty manifests in different ways than it does in more urban or suburban settings. We went to wine country, going to Sonoma and Napa counties to learn about how the story of California, certainly in these regions, is not told at all. We think about the people who visit wineries, the people who own wineries, but not so often the people who are growing and picking the grapes and making the wine industry possible. There's a talk to farm workers there. And other places in the Central Valley where immigration is going to be a huge issue, where water use is going to be a big issue, where there are so many state prisons and how the criminal justice system shapes the entire economy in a given county or city. And then some other places as well. Go to the next slide. I think the most important thing for us is, what do we do with all this? We've learned a ton in different communities across the state. Like I mentioned, 20 different counties all over California, from the Oregon border down to San Diego. What are we actually doing with this information? Well, the first thing that we did after the conclusion of the first year of our tour was put together a formal report that we delivered to Governor Newsom and his team, to other relevant legislators and labor leaders as well, highlighting the places that we went, the lessons that we learned, and related policy recommendations. The second thing that we did, which is related to this, is that as we are advancing our own policy agenda, because we're in Sacramento testifying, lobbying, sponsoring bills, supporting pieces of legislation and budget components, we're ensuring that everything that we're advocating for is directly responsive to the things that we hear on the road. Every bill that we sponsor, everything that we support, is not, coming out of thin air. It's not coming from a think tank. It's coming directly from the experiences and oftentimes the ideas that we hear on the road. So there's a clear line between those two things. And the last thing, which I think is perhaps the most interesting, is the fact that we're producing content that's designed to try to shift the narrative around poverty and its causes and the people who are experiencing it. So in addition to getting news coverage in places like the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Axios, we're producing written content, op-eds that are written by our staff or the people that we meet on the road, short-form videos like you saw earlier. And we also made a documentary that covers the entire first year of our listening tour and follows the individual stories of the people that we met along the road. But that documentary is about 50 minutes long. It's taken a bit of a life of its own now. It's been screened more times than I can count, but I know we've had events in 14 states across the country, which has been really great to see. So if folks ever want to do a screening of the documentary, we'd love to be able to connect on that. But I think there's clearly an appetite for the types of stories that are out there but aren't being told. So I think we want to continue making content that highlights people's experiences in a way that's three-dimensional and authentic, and more importantly, in their own voice rather than us trying to put words in people's mouths. So if we have time, David, we have a trailer at the end. People can also check it out on our website as well. It's only about a minute long, but I think the movie's great and it captures more of the stories that we encountered on the tour. But that's really the upshot of the listening tour. It's going to be continuing, like I mentioned, into this year, really for the next handful of years probably, because we want to get to every corner of California, because I think there are boundless stories that need to be told. But we've certainly, I think, become better advocates for it. And I think even in our small way, trying to move the needle on the ways in which people perceive both the causes of poverty and the people experiencing it.
Awesome. Thank you, Devon. And thanks, Christina, you, Devon, and Michael for all the work that you've done. Collie's here, and since she's the one who initially prompted this, I don't know if you're able to come on mic, or if you'd like to, Collie, and ask any questions, give you first shot at questions before we move on to others. But you might be in transit, so it might be hard to do. All right. Wait. See, if you wish hard enough, it comes true.
No, I'm here. I just I'm observing the material and just I'm as impressed as I thought I would be with the work that you've been doing, and feel that it's extremely important. Yeah, collecting those voices and solutions and then bringing them to the state level.
Yeah, appreciate
And
that.
yeah, I was particularly struck by the comment that you made about California being actually having the highest rate of poverty in the country, based on the cost of living, and that has been my experience. And when I talk to folks, even like funders, they're like, "Oh, California, they've got it covered," and it's the reality that I'm seeing is, uh, people are under insane economic stress in
Totally.
this state, and it has a glossy um appearance of, we've got our stuff together, but yeah, people are suffering. And I have actually traveled and lived all over the state a lot, the past few years and before, and seen that firsthand. So yeah, I would love to know more about how I could help, how I could get involved, and yeah, where you're
Yeah,
headed with this stuff.
absolutely. And I think your anecdote about funders having a misperception about what people are experiencing here is just yet another example of how the perception and the narrative about a place or a given population leads to the allocation of resources, right? Like people think that, it's not to say that there isn't poverty elsewhere in the country, but if you're a national funder concerned about poverty, your impulse might be to a place like Mississippi, where yes, there's certainly tons of poverty there and there's a lot of need. But if we don't tell the full story of what Californians are experiencing, it actually makes it harder, I think, for us to be able to ultimately address it, both within and also, external resources too. As far as getting involved, would certainly encourage everyone to check out our website. We have a pledge that people can sign on to that gives people some options through which they can get involved. Depending if you're in a place that we haven't been to yet, or even if you're in a place that we have been to yet, we can always hold another listening session. We can do a documentary screening. But we always need more people to help us out with the advocacy piece too. So I think the pledge is a good place to start because it kind of funnels people into like a tree of action to do different things. And then as far as like the storytelling goes, I think, we're always looking for more voices to be able to contribute, in this, we're coming up against a tidal wave of bad narratives that have been around for like centuries, right? So I think it is sort of an all hands on deck effort to push back against the bad narrative. So I think there's always opportunities for a storytelling component too. But thank you, Christina. I was just about to head to our website to drop it in, but that is a place where folks can sign up for continued action. But Kali, really appreciate the invitation and the kind words, and look forward to partnering on this.
Linda, go ahead.
I'm curious about the documentary and whether it's how accessible it is for people to use as an awareness array riser, I guess is the word I'm trying to say. I'm wondering if it's difficult, if it's free, and how easy it is to access.
It is. That's such a great question. And yes, it is on YouTube. It is on our website. It is totally free to use. And we have an accompanying discussion guide as well that people can, if you have a convening of folks, give some prompts and questions that people can use to spark conversation. The real goal of the documentary is for it to be an organizing apparatus, an organizing tool. So we have a lot of colleges, universities, high schools as well, churches who tend to, those are the most common places and venues where we do it, but community groups too. And so, yeah, it's on our website and it's on YouTube. And yeah, so we want to make it as easy as possible. So and Christina just dropped the link in the chat. So it's the second link that she dropped in, and that is where you can find the trailer, the actual documentary, and the discussion guide.
Thank you. That's perfect.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I should have mentioned it when I was talking about it. So I appreciate the question from me.
Aaron, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Really enjoyed your presentation. One thing I was curious about as I was listening is, did you notice any like shifts in like over the course of the years of doing it? Do you notice any shifts in the conversation? Like politically, there's certainly been shifts in that time with UBI, and now 4-day work week is growing. Did you notice those shifts mirrored in the conversations?
Yeah, a little bit. So I think you're hitting on something really really important. I think if we had done this tour 5 years ago, the conversations around direct cash aid would be very, very different. It's actually miraculous how quickly the public sentiment on unrestricted cash aid, whether it be guaranteed income or the child tax credit or anything else, it's really shifted in a pretty remarkable way. And I think it's shifted because, for better or worse, during the pandemic, we had a huge expansion of this practice, starting with the stimulus checks under a Republican president, even. And I think we saw the dramatic effects, the positive effects of it during the first few months of the Biden administration as well. In addition to the deluge of guaranteed income pilots around the country, I think people are seeing it more and more. The polling on it has changed tremendously. I think something like 80% of Democrats, at least, and I think close to a majority of conservatives as well, are in favor of the policy. So we're winning on the narrative front. I think we still have some things holding us back, but yeah, I think I was very pleasantly surprised to see. I mean, maybe it's just because people sort of know who Michael Tubbs is, and it sort of caters to that audience. But I was very pleasantly surprised to see not just a receptiveness to unrestricted cash aid and guaranteed income, but affirmative calls for it. And I think that it probably did get stronger as we've gone on. And I think that as we resume the tour later on this year, I would expect that it's even more into the mainstream. It's grown at an exponential pace in a way that has been awesome to see. But in other issues, I think we see some backsliding too. I think we're probably in a moment where, compared to where we were in 2020, or even in previous years, there's a sense that our communities are a little bit less safe than they were. I think the folks who are doing the work on the criminal justice reform front are experiencing challenges that they didn't experience a couple of years ago, just because I think public sentiment has changed a little bit. So the progress isn't linear by any means, but certainly on guaranteed income, we're in a really good moment. Last thing I'll say on this is that it's not been without backlash. And there are some states, believe it or not, in the United States who are advancing bills to ban guaranteed income pilots, which I take as both bad news in the sense that it could lead to bad policy outcomes, but I think it's also a sign that the tide is really shifting, right? It's becoming a ubiquitous tool within the broader policy toolkit, such that folks who are on the other side of the aisle are really trying to fight back against it. I don't think it's politically smart of them, honestly. I mean, I think you can keep banging the drum about poor people using the money on drugs or whatever it might be, but ultimately the polling is on our side here. So there's a concerted effort to fight back against it. I'm not involved in it so much, but Mayor Tubbs is. So I think we're going to win, and I think that the evidence that we're winning is that we're getting some real opposition now. But I really appreciate the question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a clarification based on what you said. I usually say UBI, but I noticed you're saying guaranteed income or direct assistance. Is there like a reason for that, or is that a better term to use?
Yeah, not necessarily better or worse. I think I tend to prefer guaranteed income for one main reason, which is we have a slight quibble with the U in UBI. We view guaranteed income principally, if it can go to everyone, great, that's awesome. But the priority of it is to ensure an economic floor, an income floor for everyone. And that's the main priority. If we can get to a place where everyone gets a dividend in the way that Alaska does. So Alaska has a guaranteed income program where basically oil revenues get distributed to all the residents there. It's been around for a really long time. It's wildly popular, as you can imagine, even in a red state. That would be awesome. But when we talk about guaranteed income, it really is principally focused, at least for now, on raising the floor for everyone. And then, if folks are independently making enough money to survive, they're sort of last in line to get the funds. Whereas I think when someone like Andrew Yang was socializing UBI at the national level, sort of the pitch was everyone gets this, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but as an anti-poverty organization, our focus is going to be on the lowest earners. But I appreciate the question because it's a really, really good one.
Miriam, I'm so glad you could join us. Please go ahead.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather.
No.
So I kind of just want to say, Devon, thank you so much for your presentation. It's awesome. And I think that right now there's a lot of work with narrative, looking at narratives and really understanding narratives. And I think, as you mentioned in your presentation, also like protecting the narratives that are for the status quo, right? I think that that's something that we're currently seeing specifically here in San Bernardino. And I think you mentioned something, right? Like looking at the budgets and looking at how that narrative can really, I guess you can say, like align with that budget, right? For example, here in San Bernardino, we have a lot of poverty, and because we have a lot of poverty, the narrative is that we need more funding for policing, right? Like already our budget is more than half that goes to our police, and to the point where we are becoming a policing place, right? A police state. So I think that for us is like it would be interesting to just find out more on like how you guys are kind of like winning that, you know, that front on like the narrative, or some of the wins, some of the losses, but also like the path that got you guys there. Just like, I guess, just to learn better, because we are in a conservative in San Bernardino. It's like it's considered a purple county, right? And a purple city, where we're still battling a lot of like that conservative ideologies. So I think I guess learning more from you guys on the narrative side and like how you guys win those, I guess, hearts and minds, right? Yeah.
I appreciate it. Such a good question. And we're learning in our own right too. We're sort of building the plane as we're flying it. I think what we've found, at least on the poverty front, and I have so many thoughts on San Bernardino, and we've spent some time there, and I feel like I've just learned so many horrific things about the allocation of funds, like the way that we think about job training and like kids and economic opportunity. There's so much there. And I'd love to connect on that. We need to go back to San Bernardino. But on the narrative front, I think what's been tricky for us is recognizing that it's not like a very linear thing. Like we can find traction in one subset of like the poverty discussion where we can say, yeah, maybe we're making progress on direct cash as a method for poverty because we're able to cobble together this strange coalition of folks who care about results for people in poverty, but also people who kind of hate bureaucratic red tape. You kind of have strange bedfellows sometimes. You can make some progress there. But at the same time, you can have backsliding on the narrative around how to keep communities that experience poverty safe and put them on a path towards prosperity. And I think we all recognize that spending 60% of a municipality's budget on policing is not going to be productive on that. And yet, it's something that's not unique to San Bernardino. It happens all over the state. Because it's also politically unpopular to cut police budgets, right? I think that's also been a challenge. So I think, as I was mentioning for Aaron's question, I think we're losing ground on the public safety narrative. I think what we try to do is two things principally. One, I'm not in the business of being prescriptive about what the narrative needs to be. I really want to make sure that people who are on the ground experiencing it and have the most to gain, the most to lose are the ones who are telling the story. I think that's not just like a values thing. It's actually like about me just like being competent at my job. Like I will be better at my job if I'm able to do that. But second, I think that, and this is relevant for a variety of issue areas, whether it be policing or housing or, economic mobility generally, is really trying to tell the story of people who benefit from good policies and the story of the villains who are keeping bad policies in place. And I think in an example where we're talking about a county or a city that has 60% of its budget spent on policing, I think the question should be, can we tell the story of whether this is actually improving public safety outcomes? And then two, what are we missing out on in the absence of funding for other things? Can we talk about the school program that's not being funded adequately? Can we talk about the infrastructure challenges that are making it hard for people to make ends meet? Can we talk about the fact that there aren't enough after-school programs for the kids? Speaking of kids in San Bernardino County, and I eventually would love to get your take on this. Remember, we were at this roundtable. We were in Ontario, and folks were talking about how it's sort of learning about the history of how San Bernardino and the Inland Empire broadly is sort of like the shipping hub for North America. You know, boats come into the Port of Long Beach, Port of LA, they get on a truck to San Bernardino, and then they go out to the rest of the continent, right? And how all of these trucks that are emitting so many pollutants are so often near schools, like what are the health outcomes from that? And then how does that impact the local economy where you have so many Amazon warehouses? And now you hear about Amazon warehouses recruiting at high schools in the way that like the Army recruits at high schools. And it's a very strange economic environment, but I think that's a story that's really worth telling about how policy decisions and the lack of protection for young people especially leads to these kinds of adverse outcomes. So, and the last thing I'll say, because I know I've been talking a lot on this, but it's sparking so much in me, is that we are, and I had mentioned this earlier, we are up against like so many years of harmful tropes and narratives. We have to collectively produce not just like high quality content, but really high quantity as well. Like we live in a super crowded media ecosystem, and for many people, like the only way that they experience poverty, if you aren't proximate to yourself, is like through TV or through TikTok, whatever it might be. And we have an obligation, I think, to produce like a ton more. And it can't just be us because we're a small organization with a reasonable budget. But it's really going to have to be on all of us to produce a lot, because we just have an Everest-sized mountain to climb, because these things are so they're in the air, they're in the ether, like we really have to push back. So I appreciate the question, but I'd love to partner on this because I think there's a lot to do, especially in the Inland Empire.
Yeah, and before we move on, Miriam, would you just share a minute or two on what Just SB does, so everybody here can celebrate you a little bit for what you do too?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my work per se, right? It's a collective work, but yes. So Just San Bernardino, we are a collaborative of 8 nonprofit organizations here in the city of San Bernardino. As Just San Bernardino, we are hyperly focused in the city of San Bernardino. However, the 8 organizations that created Just SB, they are focused region-wide. So Warehouse Workers Resource Center is one of those organizations. The Labor Council is another one of those organizations. Arts Connection, People's Collective for Environmental Justice, COPE, which is Congregations Organized for Prophetic Justice, ICUC, Inland Congregations for United Justice, and then there's Blue Educational Foundation, and I am missing one.
Okay, you're sick.
Yes.
We'll
I'm missing one.
Okay.
It'll come to me. But yeah, so
Okay.
all of these organizations with different bases came together, formed this collaborative, created this pretty much kind of like this Bible of the people's economy, which is called the People's Plan, which is they gathered over 4,000 surveys on like, what is it that is missing in our economy? Like, what do we see in our current economy, and how do we move forward? So that was a 2-year research phase, and we are currently going to be in our 2nd year of implementation, where we've now, that book, that People's Plan, we've condensed it to 4 issues, which is housing, community benefits agreement, purposeful pathways, and land acquisition. So land acquisition, as we are seeing, is the main one. What do we need? Our main goal is people need to have land so that at the end of it, they don't get gentrified out. We can be able to build spaces for our actual community to support our local economy. So yeah, that's kind of the pitch.
Amazing. It's so funny. Mayor Tubbs texted me yesterday, and he's like, when are we going back to San Bernardino County? Like we got to get out there. So there's a reason.
Please, we'll host you guys. Please come.
I would love to. And if I'm wrong about this, I'll be so sad. There's like a 5% chance that on my bookshelf next to me, I might have a copy of the People's Plan.
Yay! Awesome.
It's like,
yes, it's a blue. Yes, it's a blue book. Yes.
Okay, it's literally right here. If I can grab it.
Yes, please go ahead. That makes me so happy. We are only a staff of 4, so anytime we hear people that know the People's Plan, we're like, yes, we're doing our job.
Absolutely, that's great.
I can't find it right now, and I don't want to like be off camera for too much longer. But I think I've seen it and I've read through it, so that's how serendipitous is. That's great.
Awesome.
Thank you
Well, I
so
love being able to connect people. Thank you, and thank you for coming, even though you weren't feeling 100%, Miriam. We're sending you well-being from the well-being economy. Kali, would you like to go?
Yeah, well, Miriam, it's really great to know your work. I've been living in San Bernardino County for a year and a half now, and I know there's some things brewing there, which is amazing to see. So I'd love to connect. Um, and you mentioned something about land acquisition and housing being a priority. But Devin, I wanted to hear from you as well, and maybe Miriam, you can jump in. But just curious about because I love the idea of guaranteed income, and one of the things that pops into my head is like, okay, housing is like I think the #1 issue in California, and even if we get guaranteed income, it may quickly become obsolete. You know, in like trying to convince the politicians to like raise that income floor. If we have it tied to the cost of living, yes, maybe that would be okay. That's going to be hard. Um, and I'm very concerned about the trajectory of you know, the way housing and land is being bought up. Even I just saw an article about Jeff Bezos for some reason who isn't rich enough buying up land, buying up housing, and then renting it out to people, reducing home ownership. And so I don't know if you have like if you had to wave like a magic wand of something that's like very aspirational but possibly doable in California around housing legislation, what would be your top proposal or two or
I
three
have so much
proposals?
for you on this. Oh my God, I'm chomping
Okay.
at the bit. It's so funny you mentioned the Bezos stuff because I was in the Capitol last week and was talking to a staffer from Senator Nancy Skinner's office. She represents the East Bay. She was chair of the budget committee for a long time. Is terming out at the end of this year, but it's still sort of, you know, she's like the best senator that we have, very progressive. And she mentioned that they're going to be leading a bill that's going to be directly responsive to the Bezos thing, banning hedge funds from buying single family homes. And we're going to be a lead sponsor on that bill. So that's going to be a priority of ours this year.
Wonderful.
To your larger point about, you know, guaranteed income is all well and good. What happens when the cost of living continues to rise? Giving people cash is not going to be enough if the cost of living keeps going up, right? Like,
Yeah.
cost of living problem is one, people don't have enough money, but also the money doesn't go far enough. So it's two sides of the same coin. And of course, it's housing that is driving this. It's the reason why we have the highest poverty rate in the country. I think there's so much that we have to do on housing, both in the short term and in the long term. And I think in the short term, we've got to do more to keep people housed, because we know that once people become unhoused, the longer it goes, the harder it is to get rehoused, right? It's harder to find a foot. So that means tenant protections. That means ensuring people have right to counsel. It means subsidies to keep people in their dwellings. In the long term, we've got to focus on the costs. And I think that that's a multi-pronged thing. I think one, we obviously want to continue to streamline affordable housing. We also have to take on the jurisdictions and the advocacy groups that are preventing the building of any kind of housing, even market rate housing. The NIMBYs, as we call them, the folks who basically say that, you know, I got my nest egg because I bought in the 90s for a house that's $100,000 and now it's $800,000, so I'm set. And I don't want to build any more here because it's going to threaten maybe my property values or the aesthetics of my neighborhood, or frankly, oftentimes the story is I just don't want those kinds of people living in my neighborhood. We know what that means, right? So I think we've got to do more as a state to make it easier for jurisdictions that want to build and to fight back against the jurisdictions that are purposefully dragging their heels and meeting their housing requirements. So that means enforcement from the Department of Justice here in California. It means district attorneys doing enforcement work, both for the tenant side and for the production side, but we have to do both. I would love to see more affordable housing, obviously. I think the social housing pilots that are getting advocated for in Sacramento are really exciting, but I think regardless, we just have to keep building more and more. We've got to build up. We have to increase the supply of housing to drive down costs. That's the long-term goal. It's going to take time, of course, but in the meantime, we have to keep people housed. So I think the problem that's been very apparent to me as an advocate, sort of newly in this space, is that there aren't too many organizations that are focused on tenant protections and on affordable housing production and on market rate production. They're all distinct and oftentimes at odds with each other, and that's really challenging. We're part of this collaborative that is trying to bring all those folks together to hammer out some solutions, but it's really hard. And it's not because people are acting in bad faith. I just think we have different constituencies, right? So, but at the very least, whatever we can do to increase the number of homes to drive down the costs, I think that's a good thing. But it's not enough. And none of these things, you know, they're all necessary, but they're not individually sufficient.
And just a follow-up on that. A couple of things I've noticed. One is that I've actually, as I've looked, because I've moved around California quite a bit the last few years, I've noticed that actually housing outside of the Bay Area, which should be the highest in the state, is often more affordable than other places where there are no jobs and like the economy is very poor just because of the rent control, and that's been passed on. And so that's an interesting dynamic. I mean, I'd love to see that statewide.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then also I love these memes about how you know, people can afford $2,000 a month in rent, but the bank won't give them a loan for a house for less than that, you know?
Yeah.
And so I don't know what there is to be done about those two things, but they seem pretty, I mean, there's just so many ways to attack this beast, but
I am currently trying to figure out the challenge of like, I pay so much in rent, I could pay so much less for a mortgage, but I don't, who has 100 grand sitting around in their
the down payment, yeah.
Right. So it's like, it just, yeah, there's so many things that make it challenging. But yeah, I just think about, you know, I think about my parents who come from like a lower middle class background. Mom was a nurse, dad worked in a mailroom. They're both retired now. They bought in suburban Orange County in the 90s, paid 150 grand for the home. It's worth 4 times that now. And they could never afford to buy that house now. I've been fortunate to, you know, go to school much longer than they did and have a decent job. I couldn't buy that house right now. And yet people sort of are okay with that because, you know, it's like, I got mine, who cares about the next generation? I think you can't have a conversation about these things without talking about Prop 13, even though it's sort of a third rail in California. I'm seeing nods, so it seems like everyone knows what that's all about. I know there's going to be an effort to, so back in 2020, there was an unsuccessful ballot measure, you'll remember this, around trying to amend portions of Prop 13 to just focus on commercial properties that were valued at above $5 million to remove the cap on the increases of their property tax. And of course, all of the big businesses, Disneyland, which is paying 1960s property tax rates on their, you know, giant plot of land, fought back and they won, unfortunately. And I know it's going to come back in either in 2026, I think, is when we're going to see that be brought back. So I think that's one thing that can be useful, but it's an uncomfortable conversation. But a lot of people are very wed to Prop 13 as it pertains to their home. My parents are. I mean, like, they would freak out if Prop 13 got repealed because it's the only way they could be in their home. But the point is that, you know, we made policy choices back in the 70s or 80s when it got passed that are affecting us today. So, you know, we've got to take a look at what we can do to try to amend that, even if it's just focusing on the commercial properties. I think they can raise some revenue to help us out in other ways too. So it's a long-winded way of saying we've got to be conscientious about the policy choices we make today so we don't end up in another Prop 13 situation.
Rex, if you don't mind, I'd love to ask the last question and sort of lead us into wrap up at the same time, unless you've got a really brief question.
I'll help you with wrap up.
Do you mind if I go ahead and ask?
Well, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah. So Devon, you mentioned when you were responding to Kelly about a collaborative that was working together, and the name of our organization is We All Economy Alliance, which is about bringing organizations together to have more collaborative power together. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that collaborative, and just, you know, I know you talked about people signing the pledge, but your thoughts on how we get more organizations to ally together so we have more power when we go to the representatives with the different policies. And of course, we're going to wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes, so I'll just mention that as well.
Yeah, I'll be brief. So the collaborative that I had mentioned, we're brand new to it, but it's mostly housing specific organizations. So the tenants' rights orders and the affordable housers. And the goal is to try to work together to make a revenue play in as a ballot referendum in 2026 to get enough revenue to have us be able to build 1 million units of affordable housing. It's a moonshot, but we're giving it a shot. Even with people just within the housing space, there's a lot of, maybe conflicts overstating it, but there's a lot of competing interests, which is just been tough. We're brand new to it. We'll see if it goes any further. I think coalitions are really important across issue areas. And one thing that we try to do is like de-silo the conversations between folks in the housing space and the direct cash space and the criminal justice space and the labor space, electeds, funders, grassroots organizations. We've all got to get into a room and be allies with each other, make sure that we're part of the same conversation, because it's a very fragmented space. So I think what I would say then is, for an organization like yours, I'd love to be able to be a partner in this. I think there's space to bring organizations or organizational leaders from the different angles here. And I think there's like 2 verticals in which this can happen. You can bring people from different issue areas together, whatever that might be, or you can bring people from different perspectives together, which would be the policymakers, the funders, the private sector, the advocates, the directly impacted people, the academics, like all those folks. And I think either one of those, or even both, really, is a good place to start. And I have found that, coalition politics can be sometimes strange, but we go much further when we do it together. So I think insofar as we can be helpful with that, would love to. And if we, can bring others into the fold, that would be great. But, it's a very crowded space, often to our detriment, but to the extent that we can work together, I think it's to our benefit.
Rex, would you like to help close us out?
Yes, I just want to emphasize that the work your group is doing and other allied groups is increasing the well-being of people in the society. And we are the Well-Being Economy Group. It's an international organization. And we're trying to spread the word about switching more towards a well-being economy. So I was wondering if you could adapt your narrative to mention the well-being economy idea in connection with what you're accomplishing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think when we talk about poverty, or we talk about what ending poverty looks like, right? It's not just about reaching a certain level of income, right? It's much more holistic than that. Do you feel safe in your community? Do you feel an absence of a stressor, knowing that you're one small emergency away from bankruptcy? That pertains to well-being too, right? Like your psychological, physical, spiritual well-being all depends on a level of economic security too. So I love that framing. I think when we talk about, and I think it's on organizations like ours to present an affirmative vision for what the future is that we're trying to build. I think it does overlap with well-being in a really substantial way. So I appreciate that. I think it's something we can definitely do. Something we definitely should do.
And afterwards, we'd be happy to coordinate with you and give you any support in doing that you want.
Appreciate that. Take you up on it.
Yeah, great point, Rex. You did amazing. You've increased my well-being. Well, Devon and Christina, thank you again for all that you're doing, and thank you everyone who showed up today for this to help spread the good news and get the word out. And Devon, I felt like I had 20 more questions, but I'm really grateful that the group was so engaged and had lots to discuss with you, and hopefully we'll find more ways to keep working together to actually end this. So
really appreciate that. Appreciate y'all having me. Thanks for tolerating my rambling, and really appreciate the really thoughtful questions. So
yeah,
thanks.
awesome. All right, thanks everyone.